Hello, I'm Greg Pollock, and in the Touring-Vue-Router course, we'll be exploring most of the features you can find in the Vue-Router library, which allow us to create advanced navigation in our Vue 3 applications. Most of our configuration for Vue-Router will be done inside of our router/index.js file. This will tell our Vue app which URL paths load up which components and where they're displayed on our screen. To take this course, I'm assuming you have some basic Vue knowledge and are familiar with the concepts we teach inside of our Intro to Vue 3 course and Real World Vue 3 course, especially what is taught in the Vue-Router Essentials lesson, which shows you how to set up Vue-Router and the very basics of using it. On our tour, we'll be building out the events application you may have started building in the Real World Vue 3 course. We'll build in pagination, proper error handling when the page doesn't exist or the network is down, a progress bar to compensate when a page is slow to load, probably because of a slow API call, and a flash message to give our users a message that appears at the top of any page. We'll also give you an overview of most of the Vue-Router syntax you'll need to build out large Vue applications. With that said, let's get started. I'll see you in the course. In this lesson, we'll be looking at the many ways we can receive and use URL parameters inside of our components. First off, how do we read query parameters from the URL? In this URL, you can see we have a query parameter of page equals 4. And the question is, how do we get access to this value from inside our component? Well, from the template, we can simply write out $route.query.page. This will print out you are on page 4. If we're inside a component, we can import computed, use route, get the route constant, and then use route.query.page to get page number 4. What if we wanted our application to use page as part of the URL? For example, if we had events/4 for page 4, how would we get access then to the page number? Here we could use a route parameter. We define a route parameter inside of our router file by using events/:page. It's that colon there that makes it a route parameter. Then inside this template, we can access this parameter by doing route.params.page. Notice we're using .params, not .query, like we did in our previous example. And this is what our component would print out in our browser. There's nothing wrong with this solution. But Vue-Router in this case is pretty coupled to our component, and there's another way we can solve this without that coupling. In this case, we can use a route parameter with params as props. To do this, we'll specify props equals true inside of our router configuration. What this does is tells Vue-Router to send in our route parameters as component props. Then, inside the template, we write define props page. And page from the URL will get set inside the component, and in this case displayed on the page. To walk through this one more time, if we have a URL with events/4, that 4 gets sent in to our component as a prop, and then gets displayed on the page. And we get you are on page 4. Sometimes we want to be able to configure a component from our router file. To do this, we use something called props object mode. So here's a real simple example. Inside of our router file, we might specify props show extra true. Then inside of our component, we have our template. And you'll see here we're accepting show extra as a prop, and we can use it inside of our template. This would print out our homepage with some extra stuff. And if we wanted to, we could have different paths which map to this component and configure it from the router. Sometimes you might want to transform query parameters. For example, if we had this URL, Notice that query parameter of e equals true. In the case of the previous code, we might need to transform it before sending it into our component as a prop. So here we set e equals true, but really we want to send in show extra equals true into our component. So how do we transform that query parameter? In this case, we can use props function mode. So back inside of our router file, we'll write props route show extra route.query.e. You can see here we're creating a new object and setting the show extra property equal to query.e. That gets sent in as a prop using the component you saw in our previous example. That would print out a home page with extra stuff. It's worth mentioning that this object syntax is JavaScript shorthand for a full anonymous function. These two pieces of code do the same thing. I'm showing you this because in big applications, it might be useful to create functions which do more complex transformations. Thanks for watching. In the next lesson, we'll put this knowledge to use and build out pagination in a Vue 3 application. Welcome back. In this lesson, we'll be building out pagination in our Vue 3 application. So by the end of this lesson, here's what it'll look like. You can see we've got our previous and next buttons, and it loads up the events based on what page we are on. We'll be starting where our real-world Vue 3 course left off with our events application and building out pagination. If you want to follow along as we build this application, I highly recommend it. It can be a good learning experience. You can click the link below this video in the lesson resources or use this URL to get over to GitHub and either clone this repository or make sure you're in the L3 start branch and click download the zip file. Every lesson will have a starting branch. In the case of this lesson, it'll be L3 start. And if you want to check the ending code, you can check out the branch L3 end. We've got 6 steps to build out pagination. First, we'll modify the event service API call to take the per page and page parameters. Then we'll parse and set the current page from the router using function mode, as we saw in the last lesson. We'll modify the event list component to pass on page number to the event service API. We'll add pagination links to the event list template. Then we'll only show the next page link when there is a next page. And finally, we'll improve the pagination styling so it looks pretty. Let's jump into it. Our mock JSON server uses this endpoint. And if we look at the server documentation, we see that we can send in an underscore limit parameter, which is how many items to return per page, and an underscore page parameter, which tells our API which page to return. So if we call our API with this URL, it'll return 2 events per page, and it will give us the 2 events on page 3, returning a JSON string which looks something like this. Inside our application, we'll jump inside of our services directory and open up the eventservice.js. This is where we do API calls. We'll give it a per page parameter, which is the events to return per page, and a page parameter, which is the current page we're on. Then we'll build the URL string, setting the query parameters. Done with that step. Up next, we'll parse and set the current page from the router using function mode. If we want to see page 2, this is what our URL would look like. What we want to do here is get this query parameter if it exists and cast it from a string to an integer, otherwise default it to page 1. We'll then send in this page as a prop into our event list component. Back inside our code, we'll go into the router directory and open up our index.js. Here inside our routes, we'll add props, route, and then create a JavaScript object where we define the page property. And if the page exists, we'll parse the string to an integer. Otherwise, we'll return 1. Next, we'll jump into our event list component. Here we'll import computed. Then we'll define a constant for props and use define props, letting it know that we're looking for the page prop. Then we'll define the page constant here and set it equal to the page prop. Then we'll add parameters to our getEvents call, sending in the number of events we want per page and the current page that we're on, so we get back the correct events. We'll then start up our server. If you're running it for the first time, make sure you run npm install first. Now, if we jump into our browser, we can see it's loading 2 events. And if we go to page 2, it should load 2 different events. And it does. And then we go to page 3, and yep, it loads up 2 more different events. Great. Next, we need to add pagination links to the event list template. So here at the top of our component, we'll add a router link. This goes to our same event list component with the query parameter of the current page -1. This is going to be the previous page. So for SEO purposes, we'll put rel equals previous. We'll only display it if we're not on the first page, and then we'll display prev page. For our next link, we'll copy and paste it. We'll do page +1 to navigate to our next page. Say rel equals next. We'll take out this VF for now because checking for the next page is a little more complex, and we'll do that later. Great. If we take a look in the browser, we'll see that we can click our new links, but our events aren't getting updated. What's happening here? Well, it turns out the onMounted hook is only called on initial load of the component, not when the component is reused, which we're doing when we click next page. It's the same component, so Vue is saying we've already mounted this. We don't need to call this function again. So how do we tell it to make another API call when the page number is updated? Well, if we jump back into our event list, we're going to import a Vue3 function called watchEffect. Then in onMounted, we'll write watchEffect, and we'll wrap our API call inside of watchEffect. Now, when reactive objects inside this function change, it's going to run this function, this API call, again. And page value, that's our reactive value, and when that changes, we'll do another API call. Before doing the API call, we'll set events value equal to null. This way, if there's a little server latency, the browser doesn't look like it's hanging. Rather, it's just waiting for more data. And when we jump into our browser, now when we click next and previous, we can see that our API is getting called appropriately. All right. Next problem to solve. We only want to show the next page link when there is a next page. To do this, we need to know how many total events we have. And luckily, our API call returns a header that contains this information. So all we need to do when our API call returns is set our total events using this header. Then we'll use this information inside a computed property we'll call hasNextPage. This will get the total number of pages by calculating total events divided by 2 and rounding it up using math.ceil. Then we'll return if this page is less than total pages, specifically if this page is not the last page. Then back up in our template, we want to display the next page only if has next page. Now, if we jump back into our browser, we can see that when we get to the last page, next page disappears, as it should. Wonderful. Our last step is to just make it pretty, and there's nothing fancy here. I'm not using Vue-router, just using basic Vue stuff, so I'll go through it pretty quick. I'm going to wrap our router links in a div. I'll give each of them an ID, and I'll change the router text to be like this, previous and next. And I'm going to paste in some styles. I'm just using Flexbox, nothing fancy. Back inside our browser, you can see now we have these nice looking previous and next links that work. That's all there is for pagination. If you wanted some extra credit, you could try adding page links. So it says previous and then pages 1, 2, 3, and then next page. It's not going to be that difficult now that we know how many pages we have. Either that, or I'll see you in the next lesson where we'll talk about building nested routes. The code we're using, we'll be starting where our view In this lesson, we're going to be looking at nested routes, and we'll start by asking the question, how do we map actions to URLs with a single resource? Which might sound a little complex, but what we're talking about here when we say resource is typically a noun, and in our case, we're talking about an event. And we want to be able to do things with this event, which we call actions. These are usually verbs, such as listing the event details, or registering for the event, or editing the event. If we're using good URL design for each of these actions, the first one might be located at event/the ID of the event. To register, we'll go to event/to/register, and to edit the event, we'll go to event/to/edit. We'll build out the functionality for this in two different ways, but the result will look something like this, where we can click on an event and navigate between the register, edit, and details page. In our solution, we need to ask where to place these components. We'll keep them in their own folder to organize them by resource. So to look at the event details, this will be in source view event/details.view. Notice we're not calling it event details.view. We're already in the event folder. We don't need to say event again. To register, we'll create the register.view component. And to edit, we'll create the edit.view component. Now our question is, how do we create and route to these views? In this lesson, I'll show you how to solve this in two ways. First, using very basic routing. And you'll see in the solution there's some problems, including lots of duplicate code in each component. We'll solve this together by using the vue-router feature called nested routes. Let's dive into our current application. Here in the views directory, we'll create a new folder called event. We'll then bring our current event details component into that folder. We'll rename it to just be details. Then we'll create two more components. First, the register.view component and the edit.view component. If you're not familiar with our event details component, let's take a quick look at it. This component receives the ID prop, which it uses to get the event information from the API using the event service. This returns the event data, which we store in the event reactive object, and this updates our template to show the event information. The first thing we're going to do is paste in our event navigation. The first one shows the event details. The URL will look something like this. Then we link to our register component. And finally, we link to our edit component. We'll edit the router in a moment to create these routes. Now we'll copy and paste this into our register.view. All we need to change in here is the content. And we'll just put register for event here. We'll paste into the event component and change it to edit the event here. Now we need to go inside of our router. In here, we're going to change the path to our event details. We'll keep the name event details though, for namespacing. Then we'll create import statements for both register and edit. We'll copy the event details and then paste this twice for our register and edit. And then we'll simply add the path to register, change the component that that path is loading, create our edit path, and load the edit component. And if we jump into the browser, we'll see that we can now call up an event and navigate between register and edit and details. Everything seems to work, and the URL changes appropriately. As you probably noticed, there's a lot of duplicate code going on in each component, both the navigation links and calling the API. But how do we solve this with nested routes? First, we're going to create a layout for our event components called layout.view in the event directory. This will contain the navigation for each event page, as well as the API call for fetching the event. We'll then send the event into our children components, details, register, and edit. I want to mention that we kind of already have a layout inside of our app.vue. That's our base layout. And now we're creating an event layout. So if we look at our web page, we can visualize that the app.vue gives us our top navigation. Then our event layout gives us our event title and navigation. And finally, our details child component gives us our event details. Let's implement this. First, inside of the event folder, we'll create our layout. Then we'll copy the details.vue and we'll paste it into this layout. So in here, we're going to go ahead and delete the details. Here, we'll put a router view directive and send in the event that we fetch from the API down below. This is where our children components will be displayed on the screen. Now, inside of our details.vue, we can delete all of that navigation. And just contains the details of the events. Notice we have 2 root nodes here. We couldn't do that in Vue 2. And then, inside of our script tag, we can delete everything except for receiving the event prop. That's the entire event from the layout that this component will receive. We will copy that code. And inside register, we'll just paste it in and change the template to register for the event here. We'll copy that and then paste it inside of event and change that to edit the event here. Now back inside of our router, we'll copy the event details route and change it to event layout. Then we'll specify a children array. It's here where we'll nest our child components. Then we'll paste in the event details route, delete the path, and delete the props. Having this empty path means that this component will be loaded at the root path of the parent, which is simply event/id, like event/2. Then we'll cut out these routes and paste them inside the children array. We'll need to change a few things. We can delete props true. And then we'll get rid of the part of the URL that it's inheriting from the parent. The register URL will still be event/2/register, and edit will still be event/2/edit. The only thing left to do is to import our layout component. Now back in our browser, we can see that we can call up an event and navigate between register, edit, and details. We have the same functionality, but now our application has less duplication. I was going to end the lesson here, but I was speaking to Eduardo San Martin Morote, who is the maintainer of Vue-router, and he showed me how to eliminate even more code. If we jump back into our editor and take a look inside the router index, I want you to notice here that the ID is required in order to load each child path. And because of that, we can make an optimization. Inside of our layout, we can delete the params ID from each router link. And I'm going to save that and it'll put them on one line. What's going on here is that since ID is required for each child path, if ID isn't sent in, Vue-router will look and use the ID parameter that is present in the URL. So back in our browser, everything is going to work just as before, except now we didn't have to specify the parameter ID. Thanks for watching. For more information about nested routes, be sure to check out the Vue-router documentation. Welcome back to Vue-router. In this lesson, we're going to be learning about redirect and alias. As your application grows, at some point you may want to change URL paths. And how do you do that in Vue? For example, if we wanted to change about to about-us, there would be two things we'd have to do. First, update our component's router path, and then we want to either redirect the old route to the new route or alias the old route to the new route. I'll show you how to do both in your application. With either solution though, first we need to update our component's router path, which means updating our routes. Here you can see the old route. So this we want to update to about-us. If our router links are using the route name, like you see here, we don't have to change anything. They can stay the same. Now, how would we redirect the old route to the new route? We'd write path about, that's the old route, redirect, and then we'd specify the route name we want to redirect to. So if we look in our browser, we can see about is now loading about-us as it should. And if we go to /about and hit enter, it will redirect to about-us. This is just in case there's other places on the internet that are linking to our old about page, so they get properly redirected. I mentioned there's a second solution we can use here, and that is by aliasing the old route to the new route. In this case, we'd simply write alias/about. If we jump into our browser, we can see our new route works, and if we go to /about, it loads up the same content in both locations. Using both redirect and alias are valid solutions, but if you care about SEO, you might not want to use alias, because then you have the same content in two places, and Google might penalize you. Let's look at a more complex example. What if we wanted to change event/ID to events/ID? To solve this problem, first we'd update our component router path, and then we'll use redirect. Let's see how this is done by modifying our example application. First, we'll go inside of our router file. We'll change /event to /events, And now we need to do the redirect. So we'll create a new route with the path of /event/:id, and that will redirect. And here we'll create an anonymous function which sends in the to-parameter. This will return the event details route with a parameter ID of what is stored inside to.params.id. Effectively, we're passing the ID through. As you can imagine, we could do some complex logic inside this anonymous function, like if we needed to change the parameter name, or if we wanted to do some advanced filtering. In this case, though, we don't even need the to-parameter. We can delete all of this because ID will automatically be passed through because it's the same parameter name. Let's verify this works in the browser. So you can see we have the new route, event/123. And if we try to go to event/123, it properly redirects to events/123. However, if we go to a nested route like register and try to go to event, it breaks. So we need some way of redirecting nested routes. There are two ways we could solve this. The first is that our redirect path can also have children. And we'll specify path register and have that redirect to event register. We'll copy and paste this for our other nested path, which is edit, which also redirects to edit. There's another way we could solve this problem, which is a little more terse. Instead of event ID, I'll write event/:after event. And this will match on event and capture everything else in after event. We're using that dot star so that it will include slash in the match, because by default it doesn't. Then it will return the path events/to-params after event. If we look in the browser, we can see that now when we go to a nested route like register, we can go to /event and it properly redirects to events. Let's verify that with edit. And sure enough, it redirects from event to events. For more information about redirect and alias, be sure to check out the Vue-router documentation. Oh, it breaks. Oh, it breaks. Oh, it. Welcome back to Vue Router. In this lesson, we're going to be learning about redirect and alias.